Police officers, what are your holy shit, this criminal is smart moments? Most of them are really stupid, so this guy isn't a criminal mastermind, but here goes. He wanted to rob a jeweler's on our city's main street, so he found out the flat beside the jeweler's was empty, and he hid there. For 2 weeks, he triggered the alarm on purpose several times a night. Massive headache for the police and the business. We turned up to see nothing there, nothing on cameras. Thought it was just a fluke, so the jewelers turned off the alarm system and said they'd wait until the morning to get a new one installed, or that one rewired because something wasn't right. As soon as he heard that and the police leaving, he tore down the wall, had already been working on this apparently, and robbed the place, taking his sweet time. He escaped without anyone noticing anything for hours, until the jewelers came back in the morning. Then he tried to resell something he stole, which had a serial number on it, and got caught. So not that smart after all. Good effort though. Story 2. A friend of my brother moved to Israel, where for a period of time it was, or is acceptable to drive with an American driver's license. He was pulled over for speeding, and when asked for his license, gave the officer his Costco card. Costco is a membership-based retail warehouse in the United States and a few other countries. The exchange apparently went something like this. Officer, Costco? What is Costco? Friend, it's the state I'm from. Officer, that sounds made up. Friend, there are lots of states you probably haven't heard of. Have you heard of Arkansas? How about Idaho? Officer, I guess not. Friend, well, I's from the small state of Costco. The officer didn't have a response and wound up writing the ticket to someone with a Costco driver's license. Friend framed the ticket and still has it hanging on his wall. Story 3. Well, there was this one guy, we'll call him Jack. Now, Jack stole stuff, but also involved a lot of people. One time he was planning to steal a whole bunch of cars, all luxury cars. So what he did was he got his people to call 911, etc., from all different places and countries to tell them that car theft was taking place in multiple places. Oh, he also only used a few people each time, so it was different voices, people, locations, etc. So the police went each time until he actually did the crime, then no one came. He was never caught. When the owner of those cars came, the police didn't believe him. Genius right there. Story 4. The story goes like this. A homeowner walks out one morning to drive to work only to find his car missing. He reports the car stolen to police. A few days later, his car is sitting back in front of his house. When he gets inside, he finds a note. It was an apology that said the thief was in dire need of quick transportation, and so he borrowed the first car he found with the keys inside. The writer noticed the sticker on the car for the local sports team, and just so there were no hard feelings, he left 4 tickets to an upcoming game in the glove box for the homeowner and his family. So the homeowner and his family attend the game, but when they return home, they find the house has been ransacked and all items of value are gone. Story 5. There was a guy with over 50 speeding charges with the name Prawo Jazdi. He was in a different car with a different disguise every single time. Eventually, after the government set up a special task force to take down this guy, they realized that Prawo Jazdi means driver's license in Polish. Clarification. It was 50 different people. The police just wrote down their name as Prawo Jazdi every time someone with a Polish driver's license was caught speeding. Story 6. There's a small tourist town where I grew up that is divided in half by a big river. The only way between the two sides is over a long bridge, unless you go all the way around another mountain pass. These guys called in like 2, 3 bomb threats to a posh hotel on one side of the bridge. I think they even left some dummy packages. All the police went across the bridge to do crowd control, etc. The guys then called in a bomb threat on the bridge and started robbing stuff on the other side. The police couldn't be positive the bomb threat was real or not, and hesitated long enough to give the thieves a head start. I first heard this story about 10 years ago, in Banff, Alberta. Never bothered to look up what was real versus what is invented. I think this is pretty close, but as my father used to say, you can't let truth get in the way of a good story. Story 7. Here's one. I knew this guy back in the early 80 AS. Let's call him Jim. Well, he really wanted this high-powered superbike, but he knew he could never afford it. So what he did was to take drive to London and scout it about for a few days until he found that particular model parked outside a house. He goes back that night with a slide hammer, pulls the lock, and steals the bike. He gets it home, puts it in his garage, and completely strips it so that the only thing left is the frame and the bottom half of the engine, which he drags into the weeds at the bottom of his garden. Then he pours fuel over it and burns it a bit. A few weeks pass and weeds have started growing over it. It's at that point he calls the cops and reports that someone had dumped a bike frame in his garden. The cops show up and he explains that he just got back from being away and found it. The cops take the frame and note down high name and address. A few days later, the cops call him and say that the bike had been stolen from London a month or so ago, from the serial number on the bottom half of the engine and frame, and that the insurance company had classed the bike as a write-off and had told the cops to dispose of it. Now, because the frame was found in his garden and the insurance company didn't want it, the cops were duty-bound to ask him if he wanted to keep it or if they should throw it. So he tells them that he'd always wanted to build a bike. He gets the fame back from them, repaints it, then puts it all back together and re-registers it as a Q reg, stolen and recovered. I forgot to call him Jim, didn't I? If I'm Jim, no, I'm not. I knew him well, though. We went to school together, and he lived a few doors down from me. I had my own group of friends, and occasionally when out at the pub, we would bump into him, and he'd tell us of his exploits without a care in the world. As far as that bike goes, he proudly told a few people about it. But you know, we don't grass. He crashed the bike a few months later and was injured, but I can't remember how. He was pretty much a career criminal the last time I saw him, and ended up in jail for a while. While many regard him as scum, I always felt bad for him. Both his parents passed away before he was 12 years old, and he was in and out of care homes for years. Out of his 4 brothers, one was passed away, the other also passed away, and another take her life away. He could never hold down a job and also suffered from depression. The bloke had a crap life. It's been more than 25 years since I saw him last. Story 8. Working in a home improvement store when younger. This guy came in, went to the snowblowers, took one and went to the return desk. Said he wanted to return it but had no receipt. They told him you need a receipt, so he says, okay, I'll be back, and wheels it off to car through the front door. He did this a few times apparently. Couple places even helped him load it back into his car. Story 9. Obligatory, not a cop, but close on 20 years ago now, a guy on Australia's Gold Coast got away with a bank robbery in broad daylight. He cased the bank for a while and discovered a pattern of the bank manager arriving about 30 minutes before anyone else each morning, where he would leave the front doors unlocked so staff could help themselves in without a key or needing to wait for the boss to come and let them in. One morning, the crook dressed himself up for a busy day of office work and waited for the bank manager to arrive. As the manager was unlocking the doors, he made his move, entering the building and threatening the manager with a gun. He got all the details he'd need to access the vault and so forth, and then tied the manager up and stuffed him in his office. When the staff arrived, he told them that the manager had called in sick and that regional office had sent him in to do the open shop thing, and no one batted an eyelid. This bank had a small walk-in vault that normally only held about $50,000 on any given day. But old mate had timed his robbery for the morning after business banking day, when all the local small businesses would make their end-of-week deposits, and reportedly got a score of close to $250,000. Once the vault was open, he pulled his gun out and invited all the staff to enter the vault and lock them in. By this stage, the bank was due to be open, so when he went to leave, there were a number of customers waiting to get inside to do their banking. He told them all that there had been an issue with the computers and that the tech team had estimated it would take about 30 minutes before the issue would be resolved and that they couldn't open until then. Then he got into his car and drove straight to the airport and flew to Hong Kong and then disappeared. To my knowledge, the cops never caught him and never managed to find the money. They knew he'd have had to leave most of it in Australia somewhere. Because you can only take $1,000 Australian dollars in cash in any currency out of the country before customs pulls you into their interview rooms. So the assumption was that he had to have an accomplice here who would funnel the money to him slowly over time. He was identified later after witness statement and CCTV recordings led to his getaway car being discovered at the airport, where he boarded a plane destined for Hong Kong, which is as far as they could track him. Story 10. Homeless guy in my hometown figured out if he committed some act of petty theft, he'd get a night in jail, a warm place to sleep, and a hot meal. He'd show up, turn in his stolen goods, and that would be that. After a while, the police would just tell him to take back whatever he stole the next day. Quite the town character. Story 11. A French thief who spent 10 years in prison became a comedian when he got out. One of his stories: finds a building, goes in, chooses a floor, and transforms the exit door into an extra apartment. Puts the apartment number, fake lock, welcome rug, etc. Puts an iPhone for sale. The person comes to buy it. He opens the door in a shower robe and says, "Give me 1 second, I'm just going to count the money." And poof, he's gone from the exit stairs. Story 12. Probably someone who committed a crime I never solved. With that being said, I had a guy use a sledgehammer to smash his way through a wall at a Best Buy and steal a bunch of phones and cameras. He was smart enough to wear gloves and a face mask and not touch anything he didn't have to. Alarms didn't go off until he exited out the back door, which the alarm company gets after a minute or two and takes them like 4 minutes to call into us, giving him a good 5-minute head start, so he was probably a few miles away before we got dispatched to it. He clearly scoped out the area before doing his deed too. Smart dude. Story 13. A guy, let's call him Dave, I worked with told this story. He was working at a Mercedes dealership. He was sitting at his desk when this well-dressed gentleman comes in and asks if he could test drive a specific car that was parked out front. It was also a busy day. Usually, they're allowed to let people test drive by themselves after they have taken some form of a deposit or something, maybe the official ID or something, not really relevant. So Dave gives out the keys, the guy goes on his test drive and comes back a reasonable amount of time later. He walks in and hands off the key, gets his deposit, whatever back. This was about closing time, even possibly on a Friday. Everything is in order. Fast forward to the next business day. Dave's boss walks in and realizes that one of the Mercedes out front is gone. Dave has to explain that the car was returned and that they have the key and everything. Turns out the criminal didn't test drive. He drove somewhere to create a replica of the key and gave that replica back to the desk. He kept the real key, that smart son of a git. Story 14. Not a cop, but have a brilliant story. Worked at grocery store. For sales tax reasons, every item is assigned a department code. Booth clerk, underpaid person who counts all tills at end of the night, comes up with a brilliant idea. They created a new department code that didn't exist and then changed several cheap items to that code. When they counted the money at the end of the night, they would pocket the cash from that department code. Since the department didn't exist, nothing in the book seemed off. Supposedly got over $100,000 before being approached. Quit on the spot and was never charged. It took years to figure what had happened, and the company was never able to prove who did it. This was early 90s, when computers were still new to businesses and most people didn't know how to use them or what they were capable of. Security was often very lax. Had another employee write small recycling slips for small amounts as well. He would again pocket the money. He got away with $16,000, if I remember. Eventually got greedy and was caught. Confessed to way more than they had on him. Story 15. This was in the late 90s. A guy in my dorm came to school solely to deal substances. He took out student loans, registered for a bunch of 300-person freshman survey courses where he would never be missed, then literally never went to class. All he did was go to raves and concerts and keggers and sell party substances. After the first semester, he was suspended. He wrote the usual, "I was young and dumb and in over my head" sob story and got put on probation for a semester. So he had a repeat of the fall. At the end of the year, he was kicked out and didn't care. He made something on the order of $150,000 in return for about $8,000 in student loans to cover a year of housing and tuition. So far as I know, he was never caught. It may have been a short-sighted maneuver in the long run, but in the short run, it seemed fairly genius to effectively use federal loans to start your substances business. Story 16. A famous thing that happened a few years ago where I am. The robbers cased out the bank for a good couple of months, it seems, and one guy had walked in with a heavy duffel bag, and after some time had asked where the toilets are and gone in. Then another guy, wearing the same type of clothing and bag, had walked in and sat down where the previous man was. The bank was too busy to note that the guy who went in never came out, and CCTV cam shows the bank guard actually talking to this new man, and later reported in news that the guard had thought it was the same guy. This was on a Friday close to bank closing time. The bank was closed, and the first guy had been hiding in the ceiling, got down and gone to the second floor and opened the window, and cut through the grill with a small blowtorch. Let in few other guys, and proceeded to cut through the safes with heavy-duty blowtorches and stole all the money. The safes are not something like you see in movies, but standard big self-contained safes with individual alarms, which they have deactivated, around the equivalent of $2 million, and simply vanished. They are suspected of catching an illegal boat transport to India and fled somewhere after. Story 17. Not a cop. There was an incident in Fargo where a guy wanted to steal electronics equipment. The store had plenty of alarms on it, and generally cutting an alarm triggers an alarm, so instead, he cut all the alarms. This was before cell phones were really widespread and alarms were usually just connected to the phone line. He found an access point to one of the phone company's big trunk lines. Correction, 9 access points. Massive, thick copper cables with tens of thousands of lines running through them. He cut through the whole thing with a circular saw, knocked out phone service to most of the town, and robbed an audio store during the ensuing chaos. There were no leads until a tip came in from another town where he'd pulled something similar. They hadn't been able to pin that to him, but had strong suspicions, and he'd relocated to Fargo. So the cops pay him a visit. He refused to let them in because they didn't have a warrant, so the cops left to get one without leaving anyone to watch him, and he split. When they came back, they found the saw coated in copper dust and a lot of the stolen stuff. He was in the wind for a while, but even after he got caught, he had another card to play. While being transported between prisons, he used a key he'd made to unlock his shackles and climbed out the roof vent of the bus. Story 18. Dude noticed that the bank vault had put its safety deposit boxes in a way that there was a space at the 90-degree point that wall meets wall. He times it on a Friday and climbed and hid in that spot. He had actually rented out a box which he put in a clock which alarms violently to see if there are sound sensors in the vault. Waited outside? Nothing. Employees closed the vault with him inside. He has the whole weekend and gets to knocking the locks out with a hammer one at a time and stole everything. He then replaced the locks back to look like they are not tampered with and jumped back into the spot. Monday morning, the vault is open. Turns out bank was doing renovations. He picked that day, throws on a worker's jacket, and literally walks out the bank. Employees did not notice till the first person who came to open his safety deposit box. The lock fell in. They could not identify who did it, and he would have got away with it save his big mouth. Turns out he was a hairdresser and kept telling his customers how he stole from the bank, and he was a genius, and they will never catch him. Someone snitched, and he was picked up. They could not value what he stole as safety box contents are unknown. Because of this dude, all banks now fill the space where the two safety cabinets meet with concrete. Made a movie Inside Man loosely based on him. His name was William. Story 19. I have a friend who is no longer a criminal, but committed crimes for about 15 years and never got arrested or even investigated. Some of his highlights: growing weed in a shed on his neighbor's property. The neighbor was old and never left the house. Buying a building under a fake name, taking out huge loans against it, getting money and burning it all down. Sold fake raffle tickets to raffle off stuff he never had and never raffled. I can't remember how many times he pulled that scam, but he bought a new car with the money. He moved a bunch of times because people would suspect him of being a con man. His dad was in jail for similar stuff, but he was never even questioned by the police about anything. Now he has a family and a normal job. Story 20. Same thing as the computer rooms. Guys would cut the power to electrical stations, damage the wiring, then hide waiting for the cops to show up. Once the owners of the buildings came, they would shut off the power because of the unsafe wiring that would have to be repaired in the morning. Everyone would leave for the night, then would cut away all the non-powered wiring to get the copper. Story 21. Couple guys came into my old work and stole a grand piano. We had a piano which was never played, so the boss decided to sell it off. Had arranged for a company to come lift the piano. And with a lot of people coming in and out of our work, the topic of the piano, so someone obviously caught wind, the piano was moving. Come lifting day, a Luton van came in, and two guys in high-vis vests got out and mentioned they were here for the piano. They took a good 15 minutes to get the piano out of the building and into the van, and even members of staff assisted with them. They jumped in the van and sped off. No one thought any different and didn't sign anything to say the piano had been handed over. About 40 minutes later, another Luton van turns up. Two guys get out and mention they're from the moving company and is here for the grand piano. A lot of confusion around work and laughs, thinking someone was at the wind-up. The guy who bought the piano never got his piano. Story 22. I heard about one person that pulled a shoplifting scam on a large, popular, and well-known United States retail store. They walked in with some cheap nylon product to get one of those "I walked in with this" stickers they used to put on returning merchandise. The sticker easily peeled off the product undamaged. They walked to the electronics department, grabbed an expensive box off the shelf, and went to customer service. They placed the sticker on the big box and asked if they could return the item without a receipt. Unfortunately, no, not without the original receipt. Damn it. And they walk out. Customer service even gave the doorman the thumbs up, having just interacted with the customer. This took place before widespread inventory controls and cameras absolutely everywhere. Story 23. Not a copper, but this was pretty smart. I used to run bars at a number of venues around the north of England, one of which was Chester Racecourse. Usually, we just have to keep an eye out for scousers trying to nick drinks or sneak in without paying, and with it being so close to Liverpool, there was a fair amount of security on site. You could tell them, as they'd be suited, booted, a high-vis waistcoat on, and usually carrying a radio. Now there were a dozen or so bars dotted around the course, and you can imagine the amount of money that was taken from 100,000 or so punters drinking steadily from 11 until 8 or 9 in the evening. So every hour or so, the security would go round the bars in turn and take all the high-denomination notes from each till and stick them in the safe in the main building. So, I'm stood there one day, pulling pints doing the barman thing. The security blokes have been round a few times, and it's getting steadily busier. Then one bloke shows up on his own, high-vis on and radio in his hand, does the till, leaving the usual receipt so we can balance up at the end of the meeting. Bit early, I think, but hey-ho, I've got plenty to do. Then, 10 minutes or so later, two more blokes show up, dressed the same. "Oh, your mate's just been here," I said. "No need to touch that just yet." "What mate? We're the only two doing this duty today." Cue a rapid-fire and increasingly panicked exchange over the radio. Matey boy, who'd done the till before, used to work there, apparently. So he knew the drill, and he'd been watching the guards, and knew just when to time it and what order they were going round the bars in. Apparently, he got round 9 or 10 before he decided not to push his luck any further and walked away with about 80 grand, we heard later. Just took off the high-vis, dumped that and the radio, and he's just one more guy in a suit in a crowd of thousands. They were a bit stricter on the procedure after that. Story 24. Not a police, but valet operation downtown at an athletic club. Customer comes out to retrieve their vehicle, but the valet cannot find the customer's keys. Not totally uncommon for a valet to lose a set of keys. Valet calls a cab for the customer to get home and arranges for new set of keys to be made in the morning. Come back the next morning, and the car is gone. Turns out, at some point earlier that night when the valet had left to retrieve another guest's vehicle, A man dressed as a valet walked up to the key box and took a set of keys and simply walked away. The smart part was, he didn't immediately take the vehicle. He patiently waited until the middle of the night when no one was there, and simply walked up, got in, and drove off with the vehicle. Story 25. I worked with this one guy who had a lengthy record. He had a system for getting released if he got caught. After committing a crime, if the police were in pursuit, and he knew he was about to be cornered, he would act insane. His girl would play along with it, telling the police that he was off his medication. The police would arrest him, but then send him to a mental ward with papers instructing the ward to release to police once he was cleared. Once he was in the mental ward, he would cause a distraction that would make the person attending the desk with the file cabinet to leave said cabinet. He would then crawl to the file cabinet, look for his release to police papers, and then would literally eat the papers. When the psych evaluators decided that he was stable enough to be released, there would be no instructions to send him to the police, and he would be released to the general public. He did this about 10 times until police officers noticed him back on the streets. This stunt forced the state to change their procedure for detaining mentally unstable suspects. Story 26. My friend's dad was a cop, and he used to tell me all kinds of stories. There was a guy who was in a local substances organization run by the Irish who had a fake FBI badge, and he flashed it everywhere when he was around cops. He would sometimes give wrong tips to the cops, leading them in the wrong directions. Then, he would quickly leave the scene and act as if he had to do something important. The guy would be involved with smuggling and carjacking and everything, but the second cops arrived on the scene. He would just tell them that a source tipped him off. This was happening and flash his badge, making it seem as if he just got there before them. Apparently, this only worked for a few months, but he said finding out that the FBI guy they worked with was actually a member of the mob was the most embarrassing moment in their department's history. Story 27. Not a policeman, but several years ago in Cape Coral, FL, a man waited on a sidewalk in front of a Publix grocery store and used a taser on an armored car guard carrying 2 bags of money. A getaway driver in a car with stolen tags pulled up, taser guy and money bags get in, and they took off. Never caught. When I first moved to the area in the 90s, a man robbed a bank, jumped on a bicycle that he rode down a footpath through some woods, where he had left a boat on a waterway. Never caught. Story 28. Sometime in 1987, a guy placed an ad in the newspaper, looking for recruits to the Central Bureau of Investigation, the investigative police agency in India. A bunch of people showed up. He'd rented an office to interview them. He selected 26 of the candidates, told them to assemble the next day near a popular jeweler shop to practice a mock raid. He had a fake search warrant and all handy. Then he led these guys to conduct a raid on the jeweler shop. Together, they collected all the jeweler in the shop, took all the cash, and then he asked the trainees to keep a watch on the shop employees while he deposited the stuff. He then walked out and disappeared. Took half an hour for someone to suspect something wrong and call the actual police. They never caught the guy, never even found out who he was. The balls on that man. Story 29. Heard a story from a coworker. Guy was a paz and never got caught, but he was apparently constantly pulling this sort of crap. What crap, you ask? Well, he used to go take cars for test drives. Only cars with full-size spare tires. He'd go down a side road, get out and hide the tire off in nearby woods. Then return the car and go grab the tire. An interesting way to get 4 matching tires. Just pick 4 different dealerships. And the dealerships would never even know something happened till they sold the car. At that point, it could be an issue where the factory forgot to install it. And even if that was known not to be the case, how do you figure out which of the many people that test drove the car took the tire? Story 30. A guy buys and finances a car, doesn't make a single payment, and after 90 days, the repo men come looking, but can't find it. Behold, over 1.5 years later, a auto repair and customization shop files a mechanic's lien on the vehicle for over $15,000 of custom rims, tires, upholstery, engine work, and a completely awesome, awful paint job. So the auto finance company is not going to shell out $15K to get this now non-desirable car. So they sign the title over to the mechanic, who just happens to gift the car to the original owner. The original owner's credit is ruined, but what does he care? He has a brand new car, which he had been driving after about 6 months of hiding it. Genius. Story 31. My favorite was the guy who stole a post office mailbox off the street, repainted it, and then put it next to the night deposit box at a bank, and hung an out-of-order sign on the deposit box. All the businesses came along and dropped off their deposits in the mailbox. Story 32. A guy I went to high school had been stealing from Walmart in a pretty clever way. He would grab video games, MP3 players, beer, etc., and throw them away in a trash can in the garden section. The workers never checked the trash contents, and he would just wait, sometimes 5 hours until they emptied the trash in the back dumpster and hop in to get his items. Once he took a cardboard box from a display inside, filled it with video games, a PS3, and extra controllers. He grabbed some tape and pens and drew all over the box and taped it up to make it look used and tossed it. An hour later, he had a whole new PS3 and stack of games. Story 33. There's a golf course, country club in my town that has a PGA tournament scheduled in the next couple years. They have a guy repeatedly breaking in overnight and just lounging around and eating food, all on camera. The club refuses to report it so they don't hurt their chances of the tournament coming. Story 34. Not a police. We got called for a roll over car accident. We get there and the car is empty, so we think he got ejected. My partner and I start looking for a body nearby. A few minutes later, a cop tells us that they think the driver is a mile down the road walking. We go check on him and he tells us he's fine, but he wasn't driving the car. He also didn't know who was driving the car, and he had clearly been drinking. During the ride to the ER, he told me that as long as the cops don't find you in the car, the local DA won't pursue drunk driving charges. All you had to do was get out of the car and walk away from it. Story 35. One guy would print barcodes, bring them into Home Depot, and stick them on merchandise in the $100 range. When scanned, the items came up around the $10 range. Putting random barcodes on things isn't really illegal and super hard to notice. Guy 2 would come in an hour later and buy the underpriced stuff, complete plausible deniability. They would then sell the stuff on eBay. Only reason they got caught is because the guy with the barcode printer software cut the second guy out of the operation, so guy 2 stole a bunch of barcodes, put them on the merchandise, and paid for it immediately afterwards. He then proceeded to rat on the first guy and spilled the beans they had been doing this on a weekly basis for over 4 years. Because we could only pin the one case on him, the burglary was dropped down to a petty theft, and he walked away with a few days in county and a small fine. Dude probably took Home Depot for tens of thousands over the years. Story 36. It's probably one of the smartest robberies in my small city. One of the main streets is cut into a hillside, and, as a result, there is a very steep and quite tall concrete-covered bank immediately behind the buildings. Between two buildings, there is a gap that was filled at the street end by an ATM. To access it for filling, the security staff went through the next door building, out a side door and into the gap, which had the ATM at one end and the steep bank at the other. On the Friday before Christmas, when the ATM was to be filled to the brim, one of the robbers abseiled down the bank at night into the gap and waited for the guys to arrive to fill the ATM. They came early in the morning. As they came through the door into the gap, he held them up, took the money, and took off through the building to an accomplice waiting in a van on the main street. Then the van took off on the main road out of the city and vanished. After a big search, the police finally found the burnt-out van. Turned out the gang had driven it up a gorge road and had two other accomplices in cars at the top and bottom of the gorge, who simultaneously drove really slowly into the gorge and held up the traffic so that no one was there to see them when they turned off down an access road into some bush. They ended up being caught because one of the gang was a former employee of the security company. Newspaper coverage of the crime. Story 37. Not exactly the same, but I'm a cyber pie and had a case where an escort was working 3 sugar daddies. She convinced each one of them to buy her a boob job. She collected $4,500 from each of them and pocketed the difference. She got a set of boobs and $9,000. Each guy thought they were the only ones until I uncovered the enterprise. One of the daddies was a married manager. Story 38. I used to work at Chase Bank. At the time, upper management demanded that we bankers work the lobby, meaning we would grab people from the teller line and help them do their transactions. But it was just an excuse to try to get new accounts, credit cards, etc. This particular day, it's midday, and it is super busy, and one of us, the female bankers, got up to grab somebody from the line. She asks the man if he needs help, and he responds in Spanish. He says that he is okay with waiting, but she insists that he comes with her, so he follows. He sat down at her desk and handed her his note that said he had a bomb and that he was robbing the place. She looked at him and said, "Oh, you got to get in line for this." The guy did exactly as she told him. She went and told the manager on the teller side what was going on. He called the man over and opened up a window specifically for him. She went to the bathroom to go hyperventilate. The manager proceeded to give the bank robber somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000. The guy left and ran a few blocks down where we assumed the getaway car was. Nobody knew what was going on. The phone started ringing and I picked it up. "This is Chase Corporate Security. We just received an alarm from your branch. Is everything okay?" "Okay, that's funny. You got me. Who is the..." Just then I look up and start seeing a lot of commotion. A manager is locking doors. People are shuffling around quickly. You know what? I think something did happen. I put them on hold and asked the manager, and he confirmed we were robbed. He then took the call. A week later, a similar situation happened at a bank down the street. This was just as they were opening. They had a different type on entrance. Double doors on the main street, a foyer, and double doors into the branch. The robber goes in the main street entrance, walks through the foyer and realized the doors to enter the branch were locked. He knocks. Someone walks over and he slips them the note, again stating he has a bomb. The employee read the note and was able to lock the street entrance from inside, effectively locking this dude in the foyer. The employees all hustle out the back. The cops are called and he's arrested without incident. He isn't the same guy who robbed us, but the MO is the same. Spanish speaking with a perfectly crafted note in English. So, the cops asked him where he got the note, and he said that some guys picked him up at a labor site and told him that he would make $1,000 just for dropping off this note. Then, because he didn't speak English, he didn't know what the note said. I don't know if they ever hit another bank or if they were ever caught, but that has always stuck out to me as one of the smartest crimes. They're picking up somebody who is completely unassuming and who doesn't know them whatsoever. They're giving him vague instructions with a note that he cannot understand. And I'm sure once the transaction is complete, they're dropping him off at the labor site and moving on with their lives. Story 39. We had a guy come in our shoe store when it was super busy, and he asked to see a pair of shoes like any other customer. They were decently expensive shoes, probably $100, and this was maybe 12 years ago. We were busy enough to be juggling between customers, and we're running back and forth all over the place and understaffed for that kind of rush on a weeknight. Guy sees we aren't paying attention, so he puts the shoes on and walks up and down a couple times as if he's testing them out. Once no attention is on him, he sneaks 2 random display shoes in the box, covers them with the tissue paper all nice, and walks right out of the store without us knowing and out of the mall. We think the shoes are in the box when we pick it up to put them back. Worker checks the box just before it goes back, but the guy is long gone. We check under the benches and also find an abandoned pair of old busted shoes he came in wearing. Story 40. I'm not a cop, but I worked crime scene. This guy had attached GPS to the bottom of people's cars who owned houses he wanted to rob. He did it to ensure they wouldn't be showing up while he was ransacking the place. Story 41. Friend's older brother and friends used to rob cars. Never did it anywhere except for movie theaters. Guaranteed those people aren't coming back out for 2 hours. They'd take their girlfriends, 2 guys, 2 girls, wait in their car, hanging out until they saw a car with too much money, usually booming bass and loud music, which guaranteed a few grand worth of stereo equipment. They'd wait until the driver went in, give it another 30 mines just to be safe, all walk over together, and use a center punch to knock out the driver's window and push it into the seat in one piece. Immediately, they'd open the doors and cut the alarm wires if there was an alarm going off, and just start hanging out. Even if someone in the lot noticed the alarm and turned to look, they just saw 2 guys and 2 girls near a car with the doors open, looking like the driver was a git who forgot to shut off his alarm, which was confirmed when it went off in a few seconds. Then they'd proceed to just clean out the car, usually amps, subs, speakers, etc., right in broad daylight. With 4 of them, it just looked like some guys working on their stereo. They'd close the doors and then leave. They did this for a year or 2 before eventually getting caught because a father was waiting for his kids to come out and saw the entire process happen. They did some time. It was one of the smartest, stupidest things I'd ever heard about. Story 42. I'm not a cop, but I graduated with a dude that traveled around to different Walmarts around the country and bought computers cash. He would take some parts out of the computer and then return it, keeping those computer parts, and then selling them. He made over $1 million doing this and got caught. Now, every Walmart that he hit has a separate charges against him, and it's going to take a while for Walmart to build the case up. It's sad to see him go, but he was pretty cool to hang out with. But I think his flashy new Corvette gave it way. Story 43. Stopped a guy at night, willingly pulled over. Was Mr. Nice and had an answer for everything. Mistake was he left night vision on the dash, which have me grounds to search. Had a perfect toolkit for high-end brakes, radios to reach others in on the act, thermal suits, etc. Barrister turned up to interview. Offensive going equipped never stood a chance. He was released. On his way out, joked he hadn't been stopped in 10 years. Even complimented me on being proactive and observant. Records showed loads for burglary, then nothing since 2002. 2 months later, a camouflaged server site down the road was hit. 1.5 million in kit went. Police didn't even know it was there. ISP had no idea how the alarms didn't go off and how such specialized kit was difficult to sell. Knew exactly who it was, but 0% proof. Nicest prisoner I ever had. Story 44. Think it was last year. Some blokes in France went to one of those big-ass supermarkets in which they have pretty much everything and took a PS4. Proceeded to rip off the label and went to the produce section and weighed the PS after having selected apples. Sticks the printed price for apples to the PS. Man paid €9 for a PlayStation and walked out of the store. Think they caught him after the fact, though. Story 45. Can call this the smartest thing ever, but it was pretty amusing and clever. A while back, there was a series of thefts along the bus lines in my country. People's things kept missing from one city to the next, and nobody had any idea what happened as things were presumably safe in the bottom of the bus, which nobody except the driver had the access to. What happened? Apparently there were 2 guys, one of whom was really small. You get where this is going. The big guy would put the little guy in a suitcase, buy a ticket to somewhere, load him up with the rest of the luggage, and enjoy the ride, while the little guy went out, stole people's electronics, jewelry, cameras, and whatnot, then returned to his suitcase until the ride was over. Not really sure how they caught them, but it was pretty amusing to read about, and I found the whole thing clever enough. Story 46. Council officials in Newport are trying to discover who planted weed in flower pots put out to brighten up the city. More than 20 of the illegal plants were discovered nestling amongst begonias and petunias in the street flower displays. But by the time police were told and went to examine the specimens, they had already been harvested. The council said it was checking CCTV footage to find the culprits. I had never seen cannabis growing in the wild before, so it was crazy to see it, said local businessman Dean Beatus, who made the discovery. It's actually rather a beautiful plant and stood out wonderfully, but they have gone now. I don't know who took them. The leafy pot plants were growing in open view of passers-by on some of the city's busiest streets. Newport councilor Reese Hutchings, also a member of the band Goldie Looking Chain, said he thought local teenagers were to blame. It's either kids or the Newport underworld community. I'm pretty sure it's not Alan Titchmarsh, he joked, but city council officials have taken a dim view of the green-fingered criminals. It's a serious issue, and we will be informing the police and checking our CCTV cameras, said a spokesperson. Gwent Police said the fact that the plants had now gone was problematic. Now that the plants have apparently disappeared, it's difficult to determine whether they were in fact illegal weed plants or not, and if so, whether they had been deliberately planted for cultivation, said a spokesperson. Story 47. Not police, but corrections. The smartest prisoner I've encountered was also the only legitimate psychopath I've known. Young, charming, attractive, and bordering genius levels when it came to law. Some people waste time while locked up. She didn't. Every night was spent studying law books religiously. For those unaware, us inmates are granted access to a law library to work their cases. In the course of a couple years, she ditched her personal lawyer and stated representing herself successfully, writing motions, appeals, and making a killing doing the same for other inmates. If there was a technicality to be found, she found it. I imagine these are the kind of folks that end up corporate lawyers. While incarcerated, she always had a steady stream of substances, even while in isolation. She'd instigate officers and inmates alike, create a situation, then bring a case. You had to document everything with this girl. When you're accused of misconduct and cannot prove beyond any doubt otherwise, you become a liability. Several good officers were terminated during her stay. Requests to transfer her to other detention centers in the state were denied as no one was willing to take her. She ended up successfully dodging prison and being sent to a substances treatment center. Prolonged substances use took its toll, and she had a massive stroke in her mid-20s, leaving her partially paralyzed. That didn't stop her, though. During an altercation, she got out of her wheelchair, picked it up, and beat another prisoner. That's been years ago. And I have no idea whatever happened to her as I left that line of work. Story 48. Calvin. Ha ha! I have turned myself invisible. By removing my clothing, I can perpetrate any crime undetected. I have complete freedom. I can get away with anything. Mom. Calvin, what on earth are you doing in the cookie jar without your clothes on? Story 49. Having worked as a disciplinary officer in corrections, I've always been amazed at the ingenuity of inmates. The problem most run into is the follow-up of the crime they commit. Our department received a call one night that there were 3 of our inmates walking down a street a short distance away from our jail. The 3 were caught quickly. They were still wearing their stripes. However, upon doing a roster check, it was discovered there was still one missing. He was caught about a month later. So, the ingenuity was more in how they escaped. They were housed in one of our maximum security tiers. After lockdown, there's really only one way out of the cell. There's a very narrow window in each cell overlooking the yard. This was never really seen as a viable escape risk, as they were so narrow one would have to be really skinny to even attempt to try to squeeze through. Due to lack of staffing, our guard tower stayed unmanned, so they took note of that. They spent a year losing weight and observing the officers that worked the tier, taking note of which ones were lax in their duties. They loosened one of the windows, and when they finally reached a weight where they could all fit through, they took their opportunity. The officer on duty that night was so lax, he didn't notice that 4 men entered a 2-man cell at lockdown. Not just that, he didn't do a roster check at lockdown. So they got out and used a mattress to climb over the razor wire. The problem is they didn't have a good strategy for after they escaped. The one that was out the longest was probably the smartest, as he decided to part ways with the 3 who felt like it was a good idea to walk on a street in their prison stripes. But he had no real plan either. He spent his time living in people's fishing camps when they weren't around. He was caught when one of the campers surprised him and called the department, who was able to locate him shortly thereafter. Story 50. Possible urban myth, but I like it. Somewhere in England, there was this car park outside a local tourist attraction. Because it was city land, a booth was set up to collect parking fees. It cost something like $5 to park. The old man collecting the fees was a pleasant chap. Never missed a day of work in 10 years, rain or shine. One day, the tourist attraction hears there is nobody manning the booth. Because it is a city-owned lot, they call the city to ask where the parking attendant is. The city says, "What parking attendant?" Old man was never heard or seen again. He built the booth himself and manned it for 10 years. Story 51. There's a hoarder on block whose porch is covered in junk. There's also someone trying to sell their house. For some reason, people on Craigslist seem to think that everything on the hoarder's porch is free to take, even though the hoarder has made numerous calls to the police saying it isn't and denies posting it on Craigslist herself. I wonder who could have the motive to do such a thing. Story 52. I remember some thieves would go and trigger the alarm of a vacant Blockbuster after they all started closing down. They did this for 2 weeks straight, so I guess the cops became convinced that this was a false alarm going off at the exact same time every night, so they stopped rushing to investigate. One day we find out that the pharmacy next to the Blockbuster was broken into through the wall they shared. Not only that, but there was only one tiny section. The wall that wasn't covered in shelves and panels in the pharmacy, so the thieves had to know exactly which part of the Blockbuster wall to break through. Still pretty impressed by the heist, these addicts managed to pull off. Story 53. Okay, not a cop, but I got scammed big time. Now this was damn nearly 20 years ago, so forgive the naive nature. I owned a big hot tub operation in the United Kingdom. Guy calls going nuts. He's a project manager on a big job for a high-end demanding customer. My whole competitor has screwed up for the second time and not delivered his client's hot tub on time, citing shipping delays. His customer is going to flip out. The deck is ready. His guys are on site and he needs a 7-foot hot tub and is willing to pay if it can be delivered today. Of course, I can't deliver it today. I'm 2 weeks out for a delivery slot. He pleads and begs, but I can't make it happen. He asks how hard is it to move, and lots of logistical questions about the ground prep and electrical requirements. Seems so legit. He says he does like 20 or so years a year, and he's so pissed off with the other company that I'm going to get all his business. After again and again trying to tell him to duck off because I can't help him, he says, "Crap, my cousin lives near you, can I get him to pick it up?" Now in 2019 I would laugh, but then it was the norm. A hole was smooth. I say sure as long as it's paid for. He's like, "Man, I'm 2 hours away, I can get there to pay, but I can give you a credit card now." I'm leery and insist his driver gives us his license and photograph it. It all goes fine, and he calls back a month later. He's doing a big job on a new build in a small cul-de-sac for 5 hot tubs. Gives me a couple cards to process and says he can handle delivery because the first one was so easy. I tell him same deal. Well, in those days, you just took eyed and it was good. Get a charge back a month later, cards stolen, plates not matched to vehicles, licenses fakes. Took a hit for 40.000 pounds sterling, which at the time was damn near $60.000. Almost killed me. Story 54. Not a cop. Back in the 90s, I worked for a BOFA branch in a very wealthy community. It always held at least $250.000 in the safe, and often upwards of $1 million. Many citizens with large businesses banked there, and many state agencies also brought in massive cash deposits from state parks and so forth. This branch was also somewhat isolated from surrounding areas, with only one road into and out of town, which theoretically made a bank robbery difficult because the cops could easily block the exit route. Anyway, the manager told me of a story of a previous robbery. Apparently, some guy had found out the names and home addresses of the branch manager, teller manager, and merchant teller, head teller. He went to their homes and took photos of the homes. He also followed other family members to find where they worked and went to school. Presumably, this was over a long course of time. One day, he showed up at the branch dressed in coveralls and with a large mechanic's toolbox on a cart, and went over to the branch manager. Basically, he looked like he was there to fix something. He sat down and pulled out a folder with a brief letter on it stating this was a robbery and photos of the homes and family members and their schedule, where they were. He threatened to have his accomplices injure them if the robber did not call the accomplice every 15 minutes, with an obvious connection to not setting off the alarm. The manager called over the teller manager and merchant tellers and explained what was going on. They all went into the safe, and he loaded his cart with plastic-wrapped cash bricks, no marked bills, which were stupidly arranged back then. There was a small bundle of various bills, and that was it, and obviously no exploding die packs. He then wheeled it out, loaded it into a truck, and drove away. Police found the truck a few days later, and it was stolen, but now empty. Total haul was $1.2 million. As far as I know, he was never caught. Story 55. Not a cop, but my favorite bank robbery is easily Bank of America, robbed by Anthony Curcio. Dude steal $400.000 from a Bank of America with only a can of pepper spray, escapes via an inner tub, using a small army of Craigslist day workers as decoys. The story goes like this. For 3 months, Curcio observed a Brinks armored car make its deliveries to the Bank of America branch in Monroe, Washington. He took notes of the schedule, diagrammed locations of the bank's cameras, and noted the armored car's blind spots. He also estimated how much money was being transferred to the bank and how much was being removed via ATMs. He decided on using a local creek to escape and created a cable pulley system to quickly pull himself and large bags of cash upstream in the creek, using a connected canvas-wrapped inner tube. Curcio's planning culminated with an advertisement he placed on Craigslist a few days before the robbery. The online ad sought 15 to 20 workers for a fictitious city cleanup project, promising $28.50 an hour. The laborers were told to wear jeans, a blue shirt, work shoes, and a yellow safety vest. The ad also told the applicants they needed to bring safety goggles and a painter's mask. The ad directed them to meet in the Bank of America parking lot at the exact time Curcio planned to rob the armored car. On September 30th, 2008, Curcio, dressed identically to his decoy applicants, pretended to work the grounds near the bank. He pepper-sprayed the Brinks armored car guard, who was pushing a dolly loaded with money into the bank. Curcio grabbed 2 bags of money containing more than $400,000 and ran toward the creek. Meanwhile, police arrived to find the bank's parking lot filled with men matching the robber's description. Story 56. Not a police officer, but when I was younger and worked retail, we had some kids come in and take a bunch of Nike sneakers. They had one person go to the opposite side of the store and set off a bunch of firecrackers. When loss prevention ran over to see what was happening, they ran out the emergency door on the opposite side of our building. I figured it out real fast and chased after them, but they had a getaway car waiting and they almost ran me over. Story 57. A couple of my friends from high school, they were brothers, stocked shelves, worked in the back during the night. Right around when the PS4 was released, they mostly emptied a big bag of dog food and stuck 2 or 3 PlayStations in there, resealed it, and waited a few days to buy that bag from the back. Police officers have read it? Who's the smartest criminal you've ever encountered? Story 1. Guy found out that when a gas station lost its satellite connection, it automatically accepted all credit cards and would presumably process them later. So he climbed on the roof and covered the dish with foil to force it to lose connection, then made charges on a card that was canceled. Story 2. Many years ago, probably 20, my dad used to own this company and one of his employees died in a car accident. In the next few days, my dad received the work, logs and books and things that this guy would have kept with him. And that's when my dad realized this guy was doing offline transactions, what they had to do when a client needed something after hours. I'm not exactly sure how it worked. It was something to do with the physical receipt layout, but he would overcharge X amount for the item, get to work and input I amount paid and have the correct receipt and pocket the difference. He had been doing this for years and years, and my dad didn't realize. Not exactly the smartest, but he was never caught. My dad decided not to say anything to the family or anything like that. Story 3. Heard this from a retired police officer. This happened way back is when they did small street-level substances busts. They would use bigger marked bills so they could be easily traced. They would send an undercover, he would buy X amount of substances. Dealer would give him the substances and change. They would arrest the dealer, document the substances cash they found on him, and the marked bills. They would try and do a sweep, so hit multiple substances dealers a day. Thing is, no judge ever asked what happened to the change the substances dealer gave to the officer with the substances, so they just kept it and split it up at the end or the week or 2 long sting. Story 4. I was an assistant manager at a little deli corner store for a few years, and one of the employees bragged that he was getting a bag of weed a week from the store for free. Not to me, but to other employees. I couldn't figure out how. The numbers always matched up. He was also really successful with one of our couponing programs. It took me a while to figure out that our POS system would take the coupon without the UPC being scanned. In other words, the coupons were essentially cash. He was cashing out $80 a week in coupons. The kid was pretty smart. I only found out when I was doing a re-inventory and the books the same week. I saw that we sold a ton of ice cream and thought, I'm going to have to restock the crap out of that. Then realized that it was fully stocked and put 2 and 2 together. Story 5. A guy I knew went interrailing around Europe for a couple of months. Took a new credit card, used it sensibly. Paris it of when he spent more than a few quid. When he got to the town, he was getting the ferry home from he bought lunch in a cafe, then maxed it out. Leather jacket, watch, jewelry, high-end stuff. Then gets on the ferry. Mid-channel, the card goes over the side. As soon as he's off the boat in England, he calls the card company. I've lost my card in France. Last thing I bought was lunch. Provided the receipt from lunch, and they believed him. No follow-up at all. Doubt it would work now as a scam. They'd check the times. CCTV was less common. And it was all paper, not electronic transactions. Story 6. Long time ago, friend of mine used to be in a professional car thief group. They would steal 70 to 80 S model cars and trucks, strip them down, repaint, decorate, then sell them. The state next to theirs had this weird thing where if a car was reeked, it went to the junkyard, but the title was never marked at totaled, destroyed. It's been changed. So they would go buy these reeks for next to nothing, get a clean title, swap the VIN, scrap the reek at a metal yard, sell the newly VINed car at normal price to regular people. When I asked what made him quit, he laughed and said, the local district attorney. Turns out the dad was looking for a Camaro for his wife and said Buddy had a newly minty fresh one with low miles for sale. Dad, along with his sheriff buddy, knocked on friend's door to take it for a test ride, at which point said friend crap his pants. Not only was the Camaro hot, the other car in his garage 3 feet away was in the middle of a rebuild, and the truck out front had just been picked up. He was 100% convinced he was screwed beyond belief, but they took the car for a spin, loved it, and paid cash for the Camaro. Friend had a come in a moment, saw the error of his thieving ways, took everything automotive at his house to the scrapyard, then went and bought a legit car, all that very day. Story 7. In the 2000s, you could order a new credit card, not activate it. And then when you were on a long-haul flight, you could upgrade via the card machine to first class once on board, and then pay for the premium service. And when the flight landed and got internet connection, none of the purchases would be successful, and you would already be out of the airport. I never understood how they couldn't find you afterwards with your passport and credit card details, but it was a big, fraudulent scam that hit the newspapers multiple times. Maybe because apart from witness testimonies, there wasn't a sufficient paper trail to say that you were upgraded or had any of the expensive champagne or duty-free. Story 8. A very clever criminal was stealing electricity for his nightclub in Liverpool. The power company knew something was happening because as soon as this guy took over, their usage was about a quarter of the previous owner. They finally sent an old guy out to check the meter for problems. He discovered that they'd fitted a pressure switch on the door so that when it was opened, the meter turned as normal, but as soon as you closes it, the meter would stop turning. 2 years they'd been investigating before he was caught out. Story 9. I'll tell him myself if you guys want a wow, that person kind of sucks type of story. When I was younger, 16, 21 years old, I worked at an Italian restaurant that paid me cash and kept out a portion for taxes, barf. Anyways, I worked there for 5 years, and around year 2, when I totaled the amount of money they kept that should have paid, I felt cheated, even though I was supposed to pay taxes also. I had a vague idea on what taxes were, but not a great understanding. I knew enough to know they didn't pay taxes on their business, though. Being immigrants, they had a grant allowing them to not pay taxes the first 2 years they were open. I basically was mad. They were scamming me, even though I was also scamming the government. I was young and just didn't know it was as big of a deal as it is. And in my mind, I felt like if anyone deserved to keep the money, it was me, not them. I was basically unemployed for 5 years because I was never on their books. Anyways, I started getting mad because there was only 3 servers including me, and I did a lot around the store. Ordering beer, food, writing the checks for the linens and other supplies, working 10 the 5 days I worked. I was severely underpaid. We used handwritten tickets and no POW system, so I started completely pocketing certain cash-paid tickets. When I rang out the cash people, I would put it to the side and pocket it after they left and throw away both receipts, the kitchen's copy and mine. Also, when people paid card, I would have to manually enter the total amount paid, including tip at the end of the night, and then enter the amount paid for just the meal, so they knew what the tip was. On bigger checks, I would change the total for the food and drink by a few dollars under the actual cost, so I got a bigger tip. The owners were so negligent with their business, they never knew. I would like to say that I never once stole from an innocent person or patron, just the people that were scamming me. Looking back, I can't believe how much authority I had and how much they believed in me to not do the things that they were. I was so brazen and unafraid because I felt indignant towards them. Even on the day I rage quit, I wrote up a to-go ticket for a huge order like 3 XL pizzas, several of my favorite dishes, and desserts. And when the owner went upstairs for his daily nap with a woman that was not his wife, I loaded up my car with cases of wine and all the food I had made for the make-believe to-go order. I didn't have to buy groceries for days. Even though they are scam artists in their own right, I do feel pretty bad about what I did and would never do that again. Story 10. Dude hit like 10 banks and many other stores, just wearing his pandemic mask and a hood always on a very rainy, stormy day. Walked in each place and handed them a note that said he would shoot if they didn't give him all the cash they had. Ballsy. But I mean, they still haven't caught him. So damn. Pretty smart way to do it, I guess. Probably didn't even have a gun. What's funny is none of the banks ever triggered the silent alarm, and most of the stores called like 5 mins after he left. He must have been pretty intimidating. Not sure exactly what the note said. Another interesting fact I forgot. He never had a vehicle according to the security cameras. My theory is he had an accomplice somewhere nearby. Pick him up could be a number of other ways, though. Story 11. Okay, not a police officer here. Worked in a corporate hair salon. We had a class on loss prevention at one time, and the lady that came to talk about what constitutes as theft with employees. One story she told us was about another salon, located somewhere else, where the stylists themselves were stealing money right from the company. Out of 5 stylists, 4 of them were scamming the company. Instead of running credit card payments through the corporate credit card system on the POS, they would tell the clients the CC system was down and they would have to run the card through another CC system. Each of the 4 stylists had square devices that they each set up like their own business, so the charges went straight to their own bank accounts, and then the service would either be canceled or show up as a no-show. They finally got caught when a customer called corporate to complain about her service and was wanting a refund. The transaction was nowhere to be found. The sad thing was one of the stylists was the salon manager, who ended up going to prison for 3 years plus having to pay restitution. I'm not sure what the other 3 got, but I'm sure they all lost their jobs. Just blows the mind the things people will come up with. Story 12. I'm not a cop, but my friend who worked at Best Buy used to do a pretty clever scheme. It's kind of ducked up, but we were in college and our moral code wasn't exactly honorable at the time. Usually during the holidays, there is a deal where if you buy a certain TV, you get a gift card, something like $10, $20. This wasn't really heavily advertised, but a salesman would likely tell this to a customer to get them to buy a TV. Well, this my friend wouldn't tell the customer. He would just sell the TV and pocket the gift card. However, he knew that each gift card was scanned and tied to that customer's transaction, and him, since he sold the TV. So what he would do is wait until he had a few cards and then get into a coworker's computer session and buy one large gift card using the smaller gift cards. Now he could use the larger card for whatever purchases he wants without it really being tracked back to him. Never got caught, and I was always impressed he could pull this off. Story 13. My father ran film developing businesses and photography studios back in the 80s and 90s. That industry didn't age well into the 21st century. He hired a young employee who was a brilliant salesman, and the business grew into school pictures and wedding bookings soared, as did military events, and running the color lab for several local newspapers. This guy could sell anything but was a horrible photographer and couldn't run a lab, so he stayed in sales end of the business. He offered to have his tax guy to the business taxes as a steep discount, so they changed tax preparers. Immediately after the quarterly employment and business taxes went off, this guy flipped. He refused to sell, yelled at customers, didn't answer the phones, and opened film canisters, spoiling 2 weddings from the previous weekend, which had to be restaged and reshot. Any idea how much it costs to restage an entire wedding? Imagine buying 2 complete weddings and paying to rent all new tuxes, rent the same space, and pretend to do the wedding all over to get photographs, including buying airfare for family across the country. We fired the guy and were immediately sued. He paid his accountant on the back end to refile taxes as a partnership, not a sole proprietorship, and then took claim to half the assets of the business. He walked out with $250,000 in photographic equipment and color lab machines, sold his assets for cash, and disappeared. We found out much later that the same man, his accountant, and his attorney pulled the same scam with a car stereo company, a construction company, a muffler shop, and a taco franchise over the next 10 years. Very methodical and long game scam. Get in, get your accountant to get the business, file as a partnership without them knowing, get fired and sue. He did that again and again, moving cities, but keeping his attorney and accountant paid on the back end. Story 14. I just like to tell this story when I can. My dad used to race cars in the 80s, and he got caught by a police car. They turned on their lights and chased him. My dad was using headlights before that was super common, and he flipped that on and took off, and then skidded into a random parking lot, crawled through the bushes and got home, then immediately called the police and filed that his car was stolen. They already knew my dad, but were like, "Damn, we'll keep an eye out for it. Oh, look, there it is. Oh, thank God you found it." And he walked over and picked it up and drove home with it. They knew he was lying, but couldn't do crap about it. Story 15. Obligatory, not officer, but I'm a historian, and going through records about an investigation my professor did, I began to read about a guy named Juan de la Cueva. He was a Spaniard merchant from the late 1500s. He moved to Peru and started doing a whole bunch of shady business. The thing is, if you probably know what people used to say about the early modern ages, especially the Spanish Empire, you probably think that fierce, aggressive, and barely legal capitalistic schemes were not a thing yet. Well, that's not really the case. This guy Juan de la Cueva literally opened a bank so big and important, it had offices all over the Spanish Empire, from Chile to Panama, Mexico, the Andes, and Seville. We went through the records with this professor, and the things he did immediately made me think of the Wolf of Wall Street. But in the early 1600s, he had colluded himself with a guy that stole silver from the king's silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia, and illegally traded with China and India. He started selling Chinese silk in Mexico and Panama, despite supposedly navigation to Asia by private companies was illegal and only allowed for the king's fleets. He also transported illegal goods from Spain's enemy nations into the Spanish Americas. Any shady business we could imagine he did, even causing a massive inflation due to counterfeiting silver currency, which was basically copper or lead coated with silver. His empire was so big that every single merchant in the entirety of the Spanish Empire was in a way or the other connected to his company, from Philippines to the Netherlands. Eventually, a series of risky business ventures that ended badly eventually caught up with the guy. In 1635, he had to file for bankruptcy after a failed business with a ship that sunk with a lot of his money. The thing is, people caught wind of this even before he had filed for bankruptcy, and many of his partners and people that had deposited money in his bank started trying to withdraw money from their accounts. Eventually, people were forming outside his offices and his HQ in Lima, Peru. Even riots started because the bank would not open, and people could not withdraw their money. So much people had money deposited with him that it was simply impossible to give them their money, since most he had invested in other ventures expecting for returns. The viceroy had no idea what to do. Nothing of this sort had ever happened before, and people were furious. They wanted his head, but the guy was well connected. The viceroy even asked if he could get his rich friends to bail him out. Many of them had already loaned him money for other ventures. Taking the opportunity, many of them inflated the loans Juan de la Cueva had taken and ended up suing him for up to double what they actually gave him. The guy was a smart and fierce businessman, one on par with the risky business experts of today's Wall Street. But eventually, fate caught up with him. And unlike today, back then the government wouldn't bail out a corporation. Juan de la Cueva was finally put on trial, at first for having irregularities in his business, then for all the money he owed. As the investigation continued, more and more shady business and illegal stuff were uncovered. Many of his business partners were tried too after he snitched on them in order to get a reduced sentence. Some even got hanged for it. In the end, due to his cooperation, he was not executed and was placed in prison for life. The economic crisis that ensued was devastating for many. Even government institutions had their money on his bank. One detail I forgot to mention, but it's fascinating nonetheless, is that the debt he had when he filed for bankruptcy was so freaking high. His children and his children's children, and so on, were still in debt. It went on for centuries. It actually was not totally paid until the 1868s. It took him and his descendants almost 3 centuries to pay it off, since some of his first investors had given him money as early as the 1560s. Story 16. A few years back, my elderly neighbor's home robbed. Her husband had just passed away, and the obituary was in the paper with showing times and time the burial ceremony was to start. These lowlifes looked up her husband's address in the phone book and knew exactly what time their house would be unoccupied. They took absolutely everything of value from this lady on the day she was putting her husband in the ground, and they never caught them. Story 17. My company does orders over the phone and offers refunds to customers who aren't happy with the service. Order-taking employee would take an order, process the customer's card, and then at the end of their shift, refund that customer, but put the refund on a debit card of theirs. The money would show up in their account immediately and our end-of-night books would balance. So it took us a while to catch this. We did catch it because we track refunds as a measure of customer satisfaction, and refunds were up that quarter, so we started looking for the reasons by calling customers and asking about it. What refund? I didn't get a refund. Fired him, pressed charges. He pled guilty to theft, did 20 days in the county jail. Fast forward 2 years, I'm training a new manager. Heather, here's how this works. You gotta watch out for this. She got it. A few weeks later, I get a call from our card processor. Hey, we're seeing refunds to cards that haven't done business with you, and it's against our terms of service. I get the times and dates of the transactions. Grab Heather and say, hey, we got a problem. Can you see who was on shift Tuesday at 3:30, Wednesday at... Sure, I'll get back to you tomorrow. So I'm on my way home and I get a second call from our processor. We've got the name on the account that is receiving the funds. Do you know Heather? So I walked into her office the next day and closed the door and said, Heather, you got anything you want to tell me? She confessed, said that she did it once to see if it worked, and then kept doing it because it was easy. She'd stolen about $6,000 before we caught on, which made it a felony. This was a woman who I was paying $80 a year in the mid-90s. Single mom, smart. I figured it was substances. I told her to take the rest of the day off and we'd talk about it in the morning. Called the police, had them arrive a half hour before she got there. The officers were in the conference room when I escorted Heather in. She confessed to them, ended up pleading guilty to felony theft. Don't think I have to mention that I fired her that day. I did ask her why, and she really didn't have a good answer. I still don't know to this day. Story 18. Worked as trainee at an electrical company, southern Sweden, many years ago. The company noticed an unusual power loss between 2 nodes in their power grid. couldn't figure it out for years. Eventually, they got suspicious about a local farmer and could see that the loss of power correlated with him running his watering system. Turns out he's buried a big coil of copper wire beneath the high-voltage power line. By carefully crafting it, he was able to induce just enough power to drive his watering system. Story 19. Not my story, but my dad's, and I don't remember all the details. This happened maybe 3 decades ago. My dad worked bank robberies and other financial fraud cases. Most criminals he caught were not very smart at all, the way he tells it, but there was a group of guys who got involved in some kind of payroll scheme that managed to successfully and anonymously embezzle a lot of cash. Like I said, I don't remember all the details, but it involved skimming a few cents off of each paycheck from tens of thousands of checks at a time on each payday for some big companies. This was only possible because it was before the age when everything was digital as a given, and they got access to the physical payrolls, modified them, and then paid themselves out the difference somehow so that everything still added up on the books, and nobody was likely to notice the 1 or 2 cents missing from their own check. These guys had code names inspired by their group like Wizard, Troll, etc. Well, some years after my dad catches these guys, he's called in for an interview for another embezzlement case of some kind. They're doing the good cop, bad cop routine, and my dad was supposed to play bad cop. But the guy looked familiar and kept glancing at my dad nervously like he thought he was familiar too, so he just stayed quiet until a few minutes later it clicked and he says, "Hey, wait a minute, I know you. You're the troll." The other agent in the room at that point just sat back while my dad, who was supposed to be bad cop, just starts shooting the crap with this guy, buttering him up, reminiscing about what a good case that was and how good a job this guy and his friends did before they were caught, got the information they needed and closed another case. Story 20. My dad is an attorney and had 2 clients. One who had an old, huge Chevy Nova with a very well-hidden switch under the dash. He would flip the switch and the brake lights off, then go in front of someone and hit the brakes. Won several claims from insurance companies. The second one was flying into small international airports carrying normal checked bags. Flew in from Canada every time. Small puddle jumpers. Turns out what he was actually doing was smuggling immense amounts of substances. He refused to say a word to cops, or in his own trial, just pled out and went to jail. My dad gets a single check to pay for his service of sitting and doing the plea deal. About half of his normal yearly earnings. Turns out the guy was mugging for Pablo Escobar and would have been killed if he talked. Story 21. Many years ago, I worked in a department at a F500 company at one of their largest regional offices. We had over 500 people in and around the area. We obviously would need to order computer equipment and miscellaneous IT hardware. The company also employed temps, floaters that would come in to help handle a variety of administrative tasks. We were short-staffed in the department, so occasionally we would get some assistance from the temp. Once, we needed an order to be placed due to an IT emergency, so we told the temp to call our IT vendor rep and place the equipment order. We followed up a couple more times when things got busy, as it was just administrative work, before online ordering took over. What we didn't realize was that the temp also was a floater for the mailroom and the accounting department. So the temp got smart and made a series of phone orders to our IT vendor and shipped equipment to a new office we were opening up. Some servers, monitors, PCs. Things our account rep would be happy and eager to supply for our new office. Well, when the invoices came in, you guessed it, he'd just go through the inbound mail and swoop up the fraudulent invoices. Or if he happened to be working in another department, he'd catch the invoices during his near-daily stint in accounting, who were always short-staffed. So a few weeks go by, and we notice the temp has just not shown up for work. And we also get some irritated calls from our account rep saying we're like 60 days past due on a bunch of invoices. Some frantic back and forth between the vendor and accounting reveals we have no record of the purchases. The vendor fax over a bunch of invoices to the accounting department, and that's when we realized that none of the orders were authorized by it, and the delivery address was some complete unknown location. Of course, the person who placed all those orders, around $100,000 worth, was the temp. So we provide all this information and file a police report, and nothing happens. They're basically not interested in pursuing because apparently it's not big enough of a deal to them. Personally, it made me furious that we thought we could trust a coworker only to have that person be so shady. But ultimately, perhaps the temp wasn't smart as much as we were too dumb to realize that the guy was in key positions where he could defraud the company without anyone ever realizing due to the different roles he was in. Story 22. Not a cop, but a newspaper reporter covering ongoing scams involving crooked tow truck drivers and body shops. It's a scam so lucrative that tow truck drivers are burning rival trucks and gunning each other down to protect their turf. Body shops pay tow trucks kickbacks to bring collision tows, which they'll use to bill insurance companies for unneeded or overblown repairs. Toronto area uses a first available system for accident tows, where the first tow truck on the scene gets the tow, which could be worth hundreds. So what they're doing is targeting high-end cars and hiring people to trigger collisions with stolen cars, all with an affiliated tow truck conveniently around the corner. Even cops are getting into it. I wrote about one Toronto cop currently under suspension who would not only tip off tow trucks about collisions, Toronto encrypts their police radio band, he would sell police radios to tow truck drivers and either report them as lost or have an underground radio tech on payroll to clone the radio. He also operated an online service that streamed Toronto police radio transmissions online for paying subscribers, owned several tow trucks that he leased out, and even owned a car rental business. The scam fell apart after police north of Toronto did a traffic stop on a tow truck and discovered a police radio. That radio had the same ID number as one currently in service in the same division the cop worked in, and the police radio shop determined the tow truck driver's radio was genuine, but the one in police circulation was actually an illegal clone. Story 23. Joining the list of petty employment scams, I had a friend in high school who I swear was semi-retarded. Non-PC, I know, but man, the phrase suited him. We need a new phrase for this condition. He always had cash, but worked minimum wage at an ice cream shop in the mall. When he was working alone, he'd just leave the old-fashioned register open after a transaction and take the cash and make change. He was the guy that balanced the receipts at closing, and he'd usually be like $80 over for the shift. Not bad for a 16-year-old. He'd leave it so they were a buck or two over and pocket the rest. Never busted, owner was a mean-ass old retired guy. That was 40-some years ago, and I know the guy has done several stints in prison for stupid crap, like grabbing credit card receipt carbons from the trash in the old days and using the card numbers, kiting checks, little fraud scams. He once broke into a house where he knew there were expensive guitars, took a nap on the couch, and woke up to the cops. All of us who knew him figured at some level he just wanted to get caught. Worst one was, after I'd moved out of state, he was in town and asked if he could crash on our couch for a couple nights. He swore up and down he had gone straight. One day he showed up, said he quit his gas station job and was leaving for California. An hour later, the cops are banging on the door. We're scrambling to hide the bongs and rolling trays. He'd cleaned out the register and split. We gave the cops vehicle make and model and his real name. He was going by an old friend's name at work. Story 24. Not a cop, but heard this story through the company I worked for. Was a metal recycling company. Staff were allowed to take small, modest amounts of material for personal use if they needed it. Was a nice little perk. Process was fill out a form of what you wanted to take, attach a photo, and give to your manager to sign off, and that was your gate pass. Paperwork to show security on your way out. Security were contractors and didn't really know the metals. There was no real rule around what you could take, just applying fair common sense for not ripping the business off. You were allowed to take some copper pipe, expensive, as long as it was within reason and for your personal use. Anyway, there was a bloke who was asking for bits of material pretty regularly. Nothing expensive, just steel, very cheap, but wasn't being very descriptive on the paperwork, just things like sheet metal, pipe. Shortly after stocks of copper started being wrong at stocktake, they couldn't figure out why. One night, just so happened the yard manager stayed back late and did a walk through the material storage area. He happened upon this bloke who that day requested some more material, found him loading the back of his car with a few hundred kegs of copper. He'd been doing the paperwork right, but taking photos of the material he wanted in the foreground of the picture, disguising the fact he had taken the picture with copper in the background. When questioned by security, he would show the paperwork that just said pipe, and the copper was in the back of the photo. He'd then go to another scrap dealer and sell the material, where manager says, "What the heck do you think you're doing? A few hundred kgs of copper, $3,000 or $5,000. He replies, "You signed off that I could take it." Like, damn I did. Security called. He was marched off site, cops called, and he was investigated for theft and fraud. He'd stolen over $30,000 of copper and other materials. Dismissed from the company, and the security guards had to be trained to spot valuable material. They also changed the process for taking material to require a state manager sign-off, and most of them are idiot and just say no. Story 25. A friend of mine did some time as a Marine officer a couple years ago. He got a call once about a suspected drunk boat driver, which here in Canada is treated the same as a DUI in a car. The difference is when the boat is docked, it is considered a house, not a motor vehicle. Therefore, you can drink on board while docked. He pulled up to the dock that the guy was at and found the guy with his boat tied up and a beer in both hands. Buddy claimed to have just opened the drinks after tying up, and since the only other evidence was a witness who heard the guy on the marina's radio, they didn't have enough to arrest him. Story 26. My best friend growing up is a detective and had a crazy story. A couple worked at the Walmart home office annex dedicated to the startup of the Walmart self, checkout for level 1 tech. Store employees would work them to fix problems at the machines. A few months after they got fired, they started going to Walmart and scanning crazy amounts of stuff to self-checkout and walk out without paying, with a receipt, what they did. They would put scotch tape on one of the scanners, so when the associate tried to scan their badge, it wouldn't work. The workers had to input their 4-digit ID into the computer to put up the assistance menu, and from there they would cancel the item. These two knew how the system worked and would simply watch and see the code. When the associate would leave, they would get back into the menu and cancel the entire order. This would print a suspended transaction receipt, which looked the exact same as a normal receipt, except it says suspended transaction at the very bottom. They didn't get caught for over a year. Story 27. Not a cop, but my addict uncle ended up doing 15 years for a scam he had been getting away with for more than 10 years. My uncle owned a junkyard. He would buy a car, a really common one, and then he'd sell it for like $5,000. Then he'd go and steal it back with an extra key he had for himself from whoever he sold it to, and take it back to his junkyard and swap the VIN number parts out and take the titles from identical cars that should have been destroyed. He would occasionally switch out which make, model he was doing this with, but he eventually got lazy and greedy, switching out less and less. He sold the same car this way like 12 times. And eventually the cops were starting to figure it out because 3 different people who had their cars stolen said they'd only bought it a week ago, all from the same guy. And that guy would magically have an identical car, but with a different VIN number listed for sale. In order to catch him, they had undercover cops by the car, multiple times, multiple undercovers, and they took pictures of extremely small details to prove it was the exact same car. The ducked up part was, my dad was a vice cop working chop shops at the time. He knew his brother under investigation, and it put him in a really crap spot, but in the end, he just let them take him, and it worked out. My uncle got off the substances in prison, cleaned up his life, got married, and turned into a legit and legal car dealer. Story 28. Not a cop, but this was a brilliant bank fraud scheme by 2 tellers in my small hometown. The 2 ladies handpicked 6 bank accounts with lots of transactions that they noticed were not closely monitored. Construction companies with lots of expenses. This was in 2004, so before online banking was the norm for most people, especially blue-collar construction guys. They read their clients and knew exactly who was vulnerable to what they were scheming. They would falsify withdrawal documents for small amounts between the accounts, rotating through them on a daily basis. Then, they would pocket the money. Nobody ever noticed the small amounts missing. To my knowledge, they upped their game and set up a business account with the bank and started paying themselves from their victims' accounts, so it looked legitimate. There aren't many details reported in the news for obvious reasons. This went on for 2 years, and they embezzled $1.4 million. Nobody would have caught on. Their downfall was because they started taking lots of trips to Las Vegas and were buying new cars after they got cocky. People started noticing their new lavish lifestyle based on a bank teller's salary. That is what triggered an investigation. The mastermind behind it pleaded guilty, cooperated, and provided all the details to the police. She got 8 years in jail, 5 years probation, and was ordered to pay back the balance. Her co-worker pleaded not guilty, idiot, and the judge threw the book at her. What makes this sad is one business owner was quoted in the local paper saying he wouldn't be exaggerating by saying the money stolen led to hungry mouths at dinner and eventually losing his home. Bad money management on his part, but very sad. The local bank barely stayed afloat after the whole ordeal. $1.4 million was a huge embezzlement in my little town. Story 29. A bank in my hometown was robbed by a group of individuals during a historic snowstorm. We got 12 pounds in 2 days, and early in the storm, the bank was still open. A couple people just walked in masked with guns, robbed the place, and escaped on foot. Police response time was about 45 minutes at best, and by the time they arrived on scene, the tracks were gone. Long shot, but pure genius. Story 30. Not a cop, but was a coworker to one. Worked in the cage at a casino where all the money is. One girl, pretty new, kept having variances. Her drawer would be off $1,000 to $2,000 fairly often, so they started watching her more closely. We weren't supposed to help friends or family, but she would, and we're supposed to count out by hand the bills. Well, she ran the bills through the Jets can and handed the stack to her sister. Well, her drawer was $10,000 off. Turns out she put a $1 bill on top of a strap of $100 and slid it to her sister. Needless to say, she was caught. She was also stupid enough to brag to other coworkers about how she'd soon have enough money to travel and start a business when the day before she's complaining about being a poor single mom. How obvious could she be? Story 31. Usual suspect gets arrested in a light credit card fraud operation. While searching the house, detectives find a handwritten book titled My Life in Crime, which provided first-hand accounts of many crimes he had committed over the years. Some known, others unknown. Anyway, with that kind of confession sitting around where a cop might find it, you'd think he was stupid. Soon after his arrest before trial, he escaped custody. He jumped into the Connecticut River on a moonless night and went under. Nobody saw the fellow swim onto shore and disappear into the night. It was years later, he had been traveled south. There he got into some gambling stuff, and eventually opened a bank out of his hotel room, which was not a real bank. Then, when he or his mules would hit the tables, the money changers would call the bank to confirm the players has enough money to cover. Of course they did. They were stealing casinos' money all over El Carib, the West Indies, and Central America, and then gambling with it. Needless to say, the games are easier when the player uses the bank's own money to cover losses. Dude loved a posh life, mixed with celebs, political circles. Then he got caught for real and did hard time. Used the time in prison as if it were a school. Came out with a degree. Then he got extradited back to New England to face charges on the light credit card fraud enterprise he had left behind. Smart criminal for sure. Maybe a genius? Story 32. I worked as a corporate field inspector for a pretty big hardware store. My job was to make sure that the remodeling job that was sold by a salesperson was being realized properly. The problem was that the salesman didn't have any ownership of the actual job. It was just handed off to a contractor, but all of the material was sold through the salesman. They would upcharge and sell things not needed or delete important infrastructure parts if they got the sell to go through, commission-based. It was a nightmare of regularly seeing contractors not have what they need or just having too much. Contractors got a bunch of free stuff, and the salesman made higher commission. Half the time, the company had to eat most of the bill because it was so over the top. The salesman had no responsibility for the actual product they were selling once the customer left the store. Story 33. My license plates were swapped with a car of the same make and model that was stolen. They then used their stolen car, with my plates on them, in a police chase. Nearly got my husband arrested for it until I showed them my car at the train station with the stolen car's plates on them. Cops were surprised they were that clever. Still got caught in the end, though. Story 34. Totally not a cop, but guy bought a truck and needed plates, but was on the run and couldn't get things legally. Drove around until he saw a truck like his and wrote down the plate. Stole multiple plates with similar numbers and letters. Combined them into one plate using tin snips, Gorilla Glue, and patience. Drove around with a clean plate for months before anyone noticed. Couldn't even tell what he did unless you were inches away from it. Story 35. Not a cop, but I read the police reports. But at a place I worked at, the new accountant was doing the following. The manager was signing blank checks to pay the employees because it was easier, so the accountant was making out checks to employees on their vacations, days off, and then having her boyfriend go to check cashing places to cash the checks. They stole over $30,000 before she was caught over some very minor thing where she tried to physically cover up the date with her finger on something she was showing to someone in the office, and someone noticed. They did an audit, and it was found out what she was doing. The manager was quietly forced to leave by the board of directors, but one of them got him another job out of state doing the same thing. It was all hush-hush because the board of directors didn't want people knowing about it. Story 36. A guy I knew years ago had a habit of trying stupid ideas. He was involved with substances heavily and knew a bunch of dealers around town. One dealer always kept a bunch of jewelry in his room and liked to show people all the gold he bought with his substances money. I guess he felt like a small-time big shot that needed validation. Anyway, the guy I knew was close with him, and he had been told the dealer was going on vacation. The dealer lived in a fancy apartment complex in town, so he figured nothing would go wrong with security cameras everywhere around the place. So while the dealer was out of town, the guy I knew rented a white utility van and got a jumpsuit, then drove up and knocked on the dealer's neighbor's door saying he was there for a routine heating and cooling maintenance service. Crawled into the attic, the service channel crossed over above the dealer's apartment, went through his crawl space, stole his gold, money, substances, and anything else valuable he could toss in his tool bag, then crossed back over and left the building.